Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ideas for the Workplace. I'm your host, Hedia Azad, and my guest today is Wanda Deschamps, and we will talk about how to create inclusive workplaces for neurodivergent employees. Hi, Wanda. Can you just give me a little bit of background, what you do, and what's been your career journey a little bit?
So I'm the founder and principal of Liberty Co. And the focus of Liberty Co. is neurodiverse employment with a special emphasis on autism due to my own diagnosis at midlife. And I founded Liberty Co. after a 25-year career in the charitable sector, where I had been both an employee and a consultant. And so, in opening my own consultancy, I draw from my own experience as a consultant. However, it is different because, as I mentioned, I was in the charitable sector, and Liberty Co is focused on neurodiverse employment. And really, at the heart of what I'm doing is trying to help address the employment gap for neurodivergent individuals. Unfortunately, the majority of the population is either unemployed or underemployed. And so I'm trying to help address that.
Okay, wonderful. Let's dive into my questions. How did you start your work? I mean, you alluded to it, but can you give me a little bit more information how you started your work in creating inclusive spaces for neurodivergent people?
So, as I mentioned, it's a combination of my own lived experience. I received my diagnosis of autism a month before my 47th birthday. And I had enjoyed a 25-year career in the charitable sector. As I mentioned, some of it had been as a consultant. So I was familiar with the consulting field. However, when I started Liberty Co., I thought it was going to be a service to the charitable sector. That was my background. And if you imagine a split screen, on one side, I was bringing my 25 years of experience in the charitable sector to consultancy. And at the same time, on the other side of the screen, I was processing my own diagnosis of neurodivergence and was becoming more attuned with my diagnosis, was starting to delve into advocacy. And I was being approached to share my own story because I did realize there was a dearth of stories of especially neurodivergent leaders, openly neurodivergent leaders, and especially women, neurodivergent women. So before COVID, I made the decision that I was going to reorient Liberty Co., move away from the focus on the charitable sector, focus on neurodiverse employment. And it's been a great decision. And over time, it's become obvious, it was the right decision to make.
And you mentioned neurodivergent leaders. Are there any stats available about how many neurodivergent leaders are there roughly in Canada, or no stats are available?
There are some statistics in terms of individuals with disabilities who are in leadership positions, and the numbers are very, very low. However, in terms of disaggregated data, that's one of the challenges is that often, when data is shared, it is very general. And we need more disaggregated data to look at these things like within a category of disabled leaders on boards and in organizational leadership positions. How many are neurodivergent? How many are women? So on and so forth. So it's one of the reasons I do what I do. And an emphasis within Liberty Co., within neurodiverse employment, is inclusive leadership. Other areas are retention and entrepreneurial thinking. And that's one of the reasons why I focus on inclusive leadership is because we need to understand more how many neurodivergent leaders there are. We need to encourage more to disclose. And then we need to understand the importance of neurotypical leaders in the workplace and all the efforts that they can make to help build neuro inclusion.
All important points, because as you said, until we have that disaggregated data, we won't have a full picture, right? So we can't have proper solutions without the relevant data, of course. And then I like the point you made about neurotypical leaders helping with that. So, what are some of the ways they can help?
Oh, so many ways. I mean, starting with normalizing the conversation about neurodiversity. So I always talk about, allyship is really, really important. However, if neuroinclusion is not demonstrated from the top, it almost doesn't matter how strong an ally base you have. We need all these practices demonstrated from the top. So normalizing the conversation about disability and neurodiversity, increasing awareness right across the board. That neurodiversity exists. It's important to understand and then building it into the operations of the organization. Everything from developing a neurodiverse action plan with measurable objectives to ensuring that neurodiversity is considered in such practices as change management, in business planning, how strategic and other kinds of plans are rolled out and considering neurodivergence in that. And also in workplace communications, ensuring that neurodiversity is built into those and is considered. And of course, very, very important, ensuring that considerations for neurodiversity are built into the employee life cycle.
Wonderful, amazing points. So the issue often is that I find that when organizations are thinking about communications, they're not really thinking about people with disabilities and the different ways people receive information. I also really liked your points, including it in the employee life cycle, in change management. So basically, in all aspects of a business or organization, attention should be paid to neurodivergent employees or employees with disabilities, which is something that's often missing, unfortunately.
It is. It
Um,
is. Even as we place
yeah.
emphasis on DEI and IDE,
Mhm.
that A for accessibility is still often missing and
Yes.
considerations for disabled and neurodivergent employees. So the good news is that there's more
Yeah.
opportunity. As we build more awareness, there'll be more opportunity to be more inclusive and
Yeah.
accessible.
I hope so, because you're right. Often we hear the acronyms DI or IDE, but you're right. The A at the end, it's very few times that I've actually read that. So it should be brought into the forefront. You mentioned including it in different aspects of the life cycle. And well, one of the first steps is obviously attracting employees and attracting neurodivergent employees. How can organizations attract neurodivergent employees? And then once they do, how can they retain them?
So go right back to job postings and communications about your organizations. Do you actually mention neurodiversity? So if you say that we welcome applicants from all equity seeking group, including racialized individuals, individuals from different sexual orientations, genders, do you have neurodiversity and disability built right in there? And if you don't, consider it. And then actually taking a close look at your job descriptions. Are they full of clear and straightforward language? Do they highlight the key aspects of the job? Or are they full of really unnecessary points that may deter applicants? Many neurodivergent individuals, because of the biases that we face, we have nonlinear career paths. We may have gaps in employment. So do we see ourselves in job postings? Often we don't. Often the barriers can start right there. We look at a job posting and because of our background, we just don't even think, that it could be an option. So really consider inclusive language and then take a good look at your recruitment practices. So resumes, for instance, reconsider the use of resumes. Again, because of our non-linear career paths, because of gaps, resumes may work against us. Instead, focus on getting to know the entire individual, and consider asking people to call in their resume or even sending a video. Adapt your practices that can really play to neurodivergent talent. And then once you're conducting interviews, look at your interview practices. Consider sending interview questions in advance. Neurodivergent minds often benefit from some more time to process information. So consider that. Take a look at the composition of your hiring committees. Is there a level of diversity or is it, kind of the same people who come from the same backgrounds, who are bringing forward the same ideas and the same techniques, that they have been for years. And so that's a little bit about, postings and recruitment, and then retention, really take a look at your onboarding. Are you ensuring that people feel connected very early to the vision and mission of the organization?
Um,
So, in terms of retention, it's really important to consider the onboarding experience. So, the first days and weeks for a neurodivergent individual, really ensure that they're brought into the vision and mission of the organization and they understand their role and the importance of it. Developing strong relationships with the person's supervisor and with any team members that the employees are looking are working with. And then on the day to day, once move past onboarding, again, it's about strong communication, building strong relationships, suspending judgment. So many of the misunderstandings in the workplace stem because of our differences in communication, and we're judged, and frankly, we're discriminated against. So people judge us. They think that because we come across differently, that that's bad, instead of just suspending judgment and approaching interactions and communications with curiosity and asking where the person's coming from and what they want to share. Instead of focusing on a negative interpretation of difference, focus again on the contributions that the individual can make and can contribute to the entire team. And then other things, very straightforward in terms of meetings, for instance, sending meeting agendas in advance and following up meetings with, perhaps decision point. And then I guess another thing I would offer in terms of team is assign a buddy. Perhaps there is someone who served with the organization for some time who can really help on the retention side, ensuring that the employee has someone to go to. And that can be particularly helpful, back to onboarding, that can be particularly helpful in the early days. You're probably picking up that the things that I just said, they could actually be beneficial for anyone, neurotypical or neurodivergent, and that's something that comes up a lot in my work when I share adaptive practices with organizations that are focused on neuroinclusion. They say, "Oh my goodness, we should be practicing these techniques with all our employees because they would
yeah.
actually be good. They would be good for anyone."
Absolutely. That's just making people feel welcome and feel valued. I liked the idea of a buddy system, especially at the beginning when, someone's new, they don't know how things work or where, for example, where files are on a drive. Then having someone really closely helping them, I think that would be reassuring and
Yeah.
welcoming. I
Yeah.
also liked your ideas of the job poster. You gave so many good tools and tips avoiding things that are not useful on the job poster. But I'm wondering, what are some of the examples of things on a job poster that could potentially detract, from the job and make someone who's neurodivergent not want to apply?
That the number of years of experience that's required, often it's included in a blanket way. It's come from a template that's been there for a long time. Say that there's 5 to 7 years experience required, or often there's not. Often there's not. With a proper training, you can really look at other areas of experience and transferable skills. Again, because neurodivergent individuals, in a nutshell, our differences, and this is a very broad statement. However, in a nutshell, our differences center around interpersonal communication and relationships. Look at your language around communications. Yeah, strong communicator. What does that mean? Strong communication skills, a strong interpersonal relationship skills. What does that actually mean? And is it simply coming from a bias, from a neurotypical bias? And is it unclear? And then,
Yeah.
a number of other things. It's just like really going back and really reducing the number of points and focusing on what the job entails. And at this point, it might be helpful to say something that can be really helpful about recruitment of individuals is tasks. Assigning tasks during an interview so that the person can demonstrate their skills in an
Mhm.
area. Again, if sometimes we struggle with traditional interview techniques, that can really work against us. We have great skills and talents. Allow the person to demonstrate their skills and talent. So, building that, highlighting that in a job posting can be really helpful as well.
I liked another idea you mentioned earlier on including neurodivergent people on a panel because, often even in organizations that are committed to inclusion, you see that the panel comprises of racialized people, but I've never seen focus on neurodivergent panel members specifically, but that's very interesting. And I think it's something that can help very much. And I
And if
liked your
this
ideas of,
Well, no, I was just gonna
no,
say,
go
and
ahead.
if the size of the organization doesn't allow for that, you can still build awareness of
Mhm.
neurodiversity and adaptive practices for the panel, even if it's not possible to have a neurodivergent individual on the panel, just because of the sheer size of especially with small and medium businesses.
Yes. And I think it would be very helpful, even changing the job description, as you said, to make it simple. I know of an organization who serves refugees, and what they've done is eliminated any education or years of experience that's really unnecessary for the job because they're considering. So, if you're a refugee, for example, you're coming to Canada, you probably just left your home and don't even have your degrees with you, right? So it's that consideration of inclusion, as you said, to look to see, is it really necessary to put those 7 years of experience on there? Or can we maybe do with two? Is it really necessary? And like you said, good communicator, that's very subjective to me. How do you measure it so it's actually objective? So all wonderful points. Thank you for those.
Well, thank
Um,
you actually
yeah.
for using the newcomer example, because again, that would be another way of highlighting what's good for the neurodivergent population has much wider benefit. So in terms of inclusive practices, you could actually remove neurodivergent, you could insert newcomer, you could insert someone returning to the workforce because of parental leave, perhaps. Like it's so much of what's based on inclusion for neurodivergent individuals really, again, is good for everyone.
Absolutely. So we talked about job posters, attraction, retention, but one other issue that's very important in organizations is innovation. How can organizations channel neurodiversity to foster innovation?
Well, it would be going right back to maintaining an open mind about nerd. In terms of organizations appreciating the opportunity to increase innovation through neurodiversity, it really goes back to appreciating differences. And that includes different neurotypes. And so, sometimes big picture examples are, people think, oh, well, that's lofty. Richard Branson, for instance, of Virgin in the US,
Mhm.
he's dyslexic and he's very open about the power of dyslexic thinking. And okay, well, not everyone's Richard Branson. I realize that. However, it's appreciating differences, different ways of thinking. If you want to take it down more on the day to day, it could be, again, this is a general statement, but just give an example, often we need to ask questions for clarification. Again, because we process information differently, communicate differently, interact differently, we have questions that others may not have. That because their brains are more the mainstream neurotype, other folks may not have those questions. Because we ask questions, things are unearthed, including different approaches in the workplace and in organizations. So it's as basic as appreciating different different brain makeups, including those who are neurodivergent. And yeah, be open to different ways of thinking. The first The first example I heard of in this context was climate change. So I heard that we need neurodivergent minds to help us come up with solutions to climate change. And then I just started thinking, oh my goodness, climate change, our world today, conflict, inflation, pandemics, political polarization, all kinds of different polarization, racism, sexism. I realized we need all kinds of people thinking differently about these issues because if we continue to come up with the same solutions in air quotes, we're going to have the same problems that we've always had. So, again, that may be lofty for some individuals, but if that's too vague, then thinking about driving innovation more in your day to day, it's about differences. It's about, yeah, coming up with different ways of doing things that might otherwise go unnoticed or overlooked.
Absolutely. So really thinking outside the box, different ways to solve a problem, different approaches. I think that will drive innovation in organizations. This was great, Wanda. So you gave information around different points in the life cycle of an employee where, that inclusion and belonging can happen, starting from the job poster itself to the job description to onboarding, the buddy system, which I love, and making sure the employee is really welcome, then sharing their ideas to drive innovation. That is also something that organizations truly need today. Any final thoughts? Anything that you would like to share that we didn't cover, maybe?
There's resources available on my website. There's a magazine article that I wrote that was published. There's podcast interviews, other interviews. There's some summaries of talks that I've given. So, anyone who's interested in learning more, I encourage them to go to my website. Also, the main platform that I'm active on social media is LinkedIn, and there's resources there. There's also more about my background included on my website as well. Some of the stories about how I reached the point where I sought my own diagnosis of autism at midlife. So I realized, there's so much to cover. And if listeners feel like, oh, there's so much to learn, and in one short interview, I can't get it all. Well, no, and there's no expectation that you would. You know,
Mhm.
please go to my website, connect with me on LinkedIn. There's a lot of resources available. And I guess just finally, I would say that in terms of the importance of neurodiversity, considering it neuro inclusion, we are looking at about 15 to 20% of the population. So there is a practical imperative to understanding neurodiversity. That's a significant number. There's also that moral imperative. We're human beings and we have the right to live without discrimination and stigma of any kind. And we have the right to be employed. And so,
And
at the top
to belong
and
at
to
work,
belong.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really a huge piece back to your point about, being forthcoming with ideas that can really help drive innovation. The more that we feel like we belong, the more likely we are to be forthcoming. And that culture of belonging, it's so important for neurodivergent individuals. Again, that would be another example of what's good for us is good for everyone.
Absolutely. And can you give your website address for the viewers?
Definitely www.libertyco.ca.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wanda. I really appreciated our conversation today and I learned so much. Thank you so much for joining me. Please join me next time for another episode of Ideas for the Workplace. Until then, goodbye.